everybody. Well, hey, let's go ahead and get started. If you will, make your way to your seats. Most of you are already sitting, so we'll go ahead and get going. Hey, how's everybody doing this evening? Good? Good. Wow. Already got a clap going. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, good evening. It is so good to see everybody. Thank you all so much for coming out this evening and entrusting us with your time. We really, really appreciate you coming out this evening to our workshop. And if you're watching this recording, thank you guys so much for watching this, wherever you might find yourself be. We are streaming tonight. I don't know if anybody's watching on the other side of the stream, but we are going to be recording tonight's workshop so that it will be on the website in a couple of weeks in case you want to refer back to it or send the link to somebody later on. That being said, how many of you have been to a workshop before? This is not your first rodeo. Okay, good. So if this is your first time, let me kind of give you a couple of housekeeping items before we jump into this evening. The first thing to know is that you should have a workbook at your table or right there in front of you. If you don't have a workbook, then raise your hand and Gary or Kara will bring you a workbook because this workbook will be very, very important for you. Specifically, everything in the workbook that you will see, rather I should say it this way, everything on the presentation today will actually correspond to a blank that you fill in within the workbook. However, the workbook is actually designed to be an ongoing resource that you refer back to for any sort of questions or additional resources or study that you may want to dig into at a later time. Here's what I mean by that. I mean that whenever I did my master's thesis last year on the subject of transgenderism, what I did was I took all that research and then I dumped it into this workbook for you, and then I updated it so that you can have up-to-date information, and there's a lot of other resources in there that are not even covered in the thesis that I wrote last year. And so this was designed to be kind of a one-stop shop resource, so to speak, so that if you want to dig in, explore, and dive deeper and answer some more questions for yourself, this is going to be not just your workbook for this evening, but hopefully a really good, really helpful, practical resource going forward. Sound good? Awesome. Great. Well, with that being said, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and pray for us, and then we're going to jump in and get started. Sound good? All right. Well, Father God, thank you so much for bringing us together this evening. Thank you so much for every person who is here in this room. God, as we jump into this subject, we just ask that you would give us biblical clarity, that you would help us to have hearts of compassion and understanding, and that you would give us wisdom and grace by your Holy Spirit just to know how to navigate, think about, and approach these subjects and the people that are affected and associated with them. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I know that for many of us, we've been trying to forget this year ever since it passed, but 2020 actually rendered something really good and significant for me. Specifically, I got to introduce my family, my wife and my son, to one of my favorite movie series of all time. That's right, I got to introduce my family to Harry Potter. And my wife had never seen Harry Potter. My son sure hadn't seen Harry Potter. And so during 2020, when we're all locked up and quarantined up, we watched every single Harry Potter movie. I'm pretty sure we gained 15 pounds over the course of that, watching movies and eating pizza and popcorn and all those sorts of things. But what you may not know is that in 2020, the author of the books, the Harry Potter series, J.K. Rowling, got herself into some hot water, specifically on the subject that we are addressing tonight, the subject of transgenderism. In particular, she let out a Twitter post. And in that Twitter post or tweet, here's what she said. She said, if sex isn't real, then there's no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, then the lived reality of women globally is erased. I know and I love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives. It isn't hate to speak the truth. Now, what's interesting about Rowling's comment is that it's actually been feminists who have been some of the most outspoken opponents of the transgender movement. And one of the reasons why is because modern secular feminism depends upon this reality of there being a real sexual difference between male and female. And feminism says that the experience of women, the experience of females throughout history is directly connected to being biological females and the struggles associated associated with that, whether it's been voting rights or whatever. And so what she is picking up on is actually an argument that's being used out in secular culture to say, if we say that gender isn't real, then we're saying the modern feminist movement doesn't have any sort of biological connection to it at all. Now, whether the merits of that are true or not, that's up for another question, but this is the point that she's making. In response to this original tweet, some of the cast members from the Harry Potter movies responded. In particular, Emma Watson, who, anybody remember who she played in the movies? Hermione Granger, that's right. Emma Watson said this: "Trans people are who they say they are, and they deserve to live their lives without being constantly questioned or told they aren't who they say they are." Bonnie Wright, who played Ginny Weasley, said this: "If Harry Potter was a source of love and belonging for you, that love is infinite and there to take without judgment. Trans women are women. I see you and love you." And of course, Daniel Radcliffe, who played Harry Potter himself on a different platform, said this: "Transgender women are women. Any statement to the contrary erases the identity and dignity of transgender people and goes against all advice given by professional healthcare associations who have far more expertise on this subject matter than either Joe Rowling or I." Now, when you see this controversy, I don't know about you, but this whole interchange is really, for me, a snapshot into the larger cultural phenomenon that really is associated with the sexual revolution and its latest iteration known as transgenderism. I don't know, for many of us, it's like we were talking about certain things whenever we were teenagers, and then we woke up one day and all of a sudden people were talking about having sex reassignment surgeries. It's like the things that you used to talk to your kids about, you have to talk to them a lot earlier about these things, and now there's a whole new vocabulary list of terms to talk to them about, and a whole new set of things we're going to be interacting with and confronted with, either in personal classrooms, social media, relationships, friends, or whatever. I mean, I think we can all resonate with what the great anchor man, Ron Burgundy, said when he said, "Boy, that escalated quickly." And now we find ourselves caught in this tidal wave of cultural momentum. And for many of us, we're like, I just don't know what to do with this. How do we catch up? And not just catch up, but actually get ahead so that we can make a meaningful investment into our young people. And so that's what we're going to try to do this evening. What we're going to try to do this evening is we're going to try to explore some of the many different contours associated with transgenderism. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at 5 specific realities. First, we're going to look at a theology of gender. What does God actually have to say, and why is it important? Secondly, we're going to look at transgender ideology, kind of the philosophical underpinnings associated with transgenderism today. Number 3, we'll look at gender dysphoria, the actual psychological condition that people report experiencing when they have a disconnect between their biological sex and their gender identity. And then we'll look at the reality of gender transitioning, the many forms that it takes, and the consequences or results typically associated with it. And then we'll finish our time getting really, really practical. What we'll do specifically in number 5, when we ask what can we do, is we'll talk about what we as parents and what we as leaders can do on the ground, navigating this in the everyday conversations that we have. Before we jump in, I got to tell you, if there was one book, just one, that I wish every single parent and every single leader would read on this subject, that covers this subject and more, it would be the book Love Thy Body by Nancy Pearcey, answering the hard questions about life and sexuality. Really, anything that Nancy Pearcey writes, I think you should read. Just throwing that out there. But this book in particular is a wonderful book that navigates so many of the questions associated with the sexual revolution from a biblical perspective. Sound good? All right. So, if you have your workbooks, many of you are already there, go ahead and open up to page 5. And like I said, there are more resources inside this workbook than what we're going to cover in the presentation. And so we will move quite quickly through the workbook this evening. So be ready to write and turn, because we are going to get going and keep going. Let's talk about, to begin, a theology of gender, specifically by looking at the significance of the body. What does God have to say about the human body? Number one, God created us male and female. God created us male and female. Genesis 1:27. It's been the core passage that we've looked at in our sermon series the last several weeks. Now, it's easy for us to miss the significance of this. But when we say God created, that fundamentally sets Christianity apart from a secular worldview. Because what we are saying is that human beings, in particular, our maleness and our femaleness, are not the accident of biological evolution. It is not the case that we are just simply coughed up from natural processes and we accidentally and incidentally became male and or female. Rather, when we say that someone is created male or female, we are saying that it is the loving and fatherly intention of an all-wise creator that we are male or female. The way we say it in street-level terms in our house is God created you on purpose for a purpose. God created you male on purpose or female on purpose. And what's interesting is that when Jesus was asked a question about human marriage in particular, he referred back to Genesis 1:27 as normative for understanding human identity and behavior. In other words, if we want to be faithful followers of Jesus and believe what Jesus believed, then one of those things that he believed is that God created men and women, male and female, on purpose with loving intention. Not only that, but Jesus affirmed the goodness of the human body. He affirmed the goodness of the human body in at least three ways: in his incarnation, in his resurrection, and in his ascension. To say that God became a man was a radical claim in the ancient world. To say that God took on flesh and actually enveloped himself with human biological reality was a radical notion in the ancient world. But it means that the human body, even though it is affected by sin, is not inherently bad, not inherently good, to the point that God himself, who is holy and perfect in all his ways, joined himself with the human body without incorporating any type of sin or evil in the process. In his resurrection, the fact that Jesus didn't just come back as a ghost or as a disembodied spirit, the fact that he came back as a biological man, as a human, the fact that he was resurrected, not just coming back as a spirit, means that the body is not just something to be discarded and removed and left behind, but rather is something in and of itself a good thing. In fact, the ascension tells us this even more powerfully. It is a mystery to me. Don't ask me to explain how this works, but the second person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ, right now, presently has a human body. Within the Trinity, there is a human body within the one being that is three persons known as God. Again, if you try to get me to explain how that's going to work, we're going to end up feeling like we're gargling peanut butter. That's going to be very, very difficult to explain, and yet it is something clearly and truly taught in the Scriptures. Number 4, Paul, the Apostle Paul, says that for Christians, our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit. Now, many of you have heard that probably growing up, that we are temples of the Holy Spirit. In the ancient world, the temple for any religious system was where heaven and earth met. It's where the divine and the human joined together. For Paul to say that the Christian is a temple of the Holy Spirit is to say that within our bodies, there is literally a divine meeting place between heaven and earth. That God has taken up residence inside the human body, inside the human person, and joined himself to us. And then number 5, we will have redeemed bodies in the new creation. I don't know about y'all, but whenever I was growing up, when I thought about heaven, I kind of thought about heaven as like I'm going to be floating on clouds with a harp, maybe playing a bunch of Chris Tomlin songs and listening to, K-Love for the rest of eternity. That's really not a biblical picture of heaven. Our actual final destination is not up in the clouds. It's back here on earth. But it's back here on earth in a redeemed earth, a new earth, an earth without sickness, death, or destruction, with human bodies that are not affected by sickness, death, or destruction. I mean, can you imagine having a human body without allergy problems? Without insomnia? I mean, my goodness, but that is what God tells us. What does that mean? It means that heaven is not simply a disembodied state where the human body has no place. No, part and parcel of the joy and the experience of heaven will be a physical, embodied reality. When you turn the page, here's what we're saying, that all through the Bible, there are 5 key doctrines that teach us a healthy theology of gender: creation, incarnation, resurrection, ascension, and new creation. These are on page 8 there in your notes. In other words, from the very beginning of the Bible, from creation to the very end in new creation, and everywhere in between, the Bible affirms the goodness of the human body as part of God's good and loving design for us, but also as an indicator, as a moral messaging center for understanding human identity as biologically male or female. Why do I emphasize this so much? Because there is an old heresy that has been around for hundreds of years. The early church had to deal with it. There's echoes of it in the New Testament, like in 1 John and other places, and it is the heresy known as Gnosticism. Gnosticism, from the Greek word gnosis, Gnosis, or Gnosticism is the actual term. What did the Gnostics teach? To put it simply, they denied the inherent goodness of material creation. They actually taught that physical matter was evil, that it was bad. See, for the Gnostics, they had their own version of the creation story. And for them, creation was not the good and loving byproduct of an intentional God. Instead, it was more or less the byproduct of consequences that took place whenever different gods were battling it out for the creation story. And for them, physical matter was just kind of something you have to deal with, something you have to put up with. But in the end, the true self, the best things in life were not the embodied realities. It was the spiritual. It was the internal. That's why they were called Gnostics, because for them, gnosis or knowledge meant transcending physical limitations and achieving a higher plane of enlightenment or spiritual understanding. For them, heaven was a total discarding of the physical body. For the Gnostics, ultimate self-expression, ultimate human fulfillment came when we left the physical body behind. And this is significant because in almost every generation, the church has had to deal with some sort of reversion or repackaging of this ancient heresy known as Gnosticism. In fact, we're seeing it today with the transgender movement. Because the transgender movement would say that the inherent biological realities of the human body are less significant than the internal realities of human understanding. I love how Andrew Walker says it in his book, God and the Transgender Debate. He says this: Gnosticism emphasizes that a person's self-awareness is different than and more important than their physical body. This is the first quote underneath that section. Gnosticism says that there is an inherent tension between our true selves and the bodies we inhabit. The idea that our true self is different than the body we live in communicates that our body is something less than us and can be used, shaped, or changed to match how we feel. The concept that our gender identity can be different than our biological sex is a modern form of the old Gnostic idea. So this is important to see, that already we're into theological territory. That whenever we think about what it means to be human, the Bible would say there is not an internal us and an exterior us that are separate from each other. No, what it means to be human means to be both soul and body and soul. Now, there is a distinction between our soul and our body, But there is not a separation between our soul and our body in terms of what it means to be fully and truly human. Yes, if we die right now, our bodies go into the ground, our souls go be with God. But the reason why they are rejoined together in the new creation is because God's good and loving plan is that that separation will not be permanent, but only temporary, so that we can experience true humanity in the new creation, both as body and soul, soul and body together. In other words, the Bible says this. The Bible teaches that material creation is good. It's good. We're on page 9. The Bible teaches that material creation, yes, it has been affected by the fall into sin, but it has not lost its original goodness. Not only that, the Bible teaches a much more integrated view of humanity. It is not this strong bifurcation between soul and body. Again, there is a distinction, but they are integrated together. You could say it this way, that we are embodied souls and ensouled bodies. Now, there exists, in other words, both a physical and a non-physical aspect to our humanity. According to the Bible, our bodies are something to honor and submit to, not discard or to mutilate. God's intention for our body is that we listen to our bodies as an indicator of God's good design. Now, of course, there are complications and there are difficulties associated with the human body. There is sickness, and we'll talk about puberty here in a little bit, but there's all sorts of complicating realities, and at the same time, the inherent blueprint, the basic design, is that God would actually speak to us or communicate to us through His biological design of us as male or female. Now, in all of our talk about this, we must not go to the other extreme, okay? We must not go to the other extreme and say that people are just bodies. We can't just say that it's just the body and nothing else. I identify with this picture personally. That's exactly how my wife feels about me. I don't know about y'all, but Gary, you understand this, right? You've expressed the same concern to me. So in other words, what we have to do is we have to avoid two extremes. One extreme is what I think is transgenderism, where it's just the inner life or the soul. The other extreme is materialism, where it's just the outer life or the physical. Christianity brings these two together. The first big idea you need to know, and this is in your notes, is the biblical ethic is an embodied ethic. It's an embodied ethic. In many ways, what we're doing whenever we're talking about these moral and sexual realities is we are trying to get back to understanding God's design and purpose for our bodies, not just for our feelings, desires, and attractions. So that's what the Bible says. What's interesting is that when we look at modern science, we actually get a lot of confirmation and collaboration with what the Bible basically teaches on this subject. And so, what we're going to talk about now is really the summarized findings of this book by Leonard Sachs, who's a medical doctor and a professional child psychologist, in his book, Why Gender Matters, what parents and teachers need to know about the emerging science of sex differences. And so we're going to fill in some blanks. When you look at basic biology, science tells us that there are, in fact, real, true, scientifically observed biological differences between male and female. Number one is sex. Our reproductive organs are, in fact, biologically different than each other. This is an obvious fact at birth. It's the reason why we do and can do gender reveal parties and actually assign or really label a certain gender whenever a baby is born. Number two is size. By and large, males are bigger than females. And I don't just mean like height and weight. I mean like bone structure and certain aspects of our DNA actually, on average, are larger and denser, and that's why men, on average, tend to weigh more and are larger than women. Number three, this corresponds to the differences in strength. Men have this hormone in our bodies called testosterone. Now, women have this as well, but men tend to have it in much larger doses and in much larger numbers. All of that corresponds to being stronger and more physically apt when it comes to certain environments. There's a reason why in the message from, not today, but last Sunday, when I joked about how my wife and I are reverse stereotyped, I also made a point to say, but if somebody breaks into the house, I'm not going to say, hey, honey, go deal with that for me. There's a reason why I'm going to be the first one to go take care of the bad guy, because even if she has a black belt in Taekwondo, I'm still physically more capable of dealing with the intruder on average. So those are three things that right away correspond to. These next two, I just got to tell you, are just funny and hilarious to me. Because I did not know this, although I had a hunch, and I would guess that all the ladies in this room had a hunch that this was true. There are also differences, not just in terms of sex, not just in terms of size, not just in terms of strength, but also there are scientifically observed biological differences when it comes to smell. Smell. That's right. Women have better senses of smell than men do. In fact, in a 2005 study, repeated exposure to the same smell led women to have a 100,000% increase in detecting the same smells, but men, after repeated exposure to the same smell, showed zero improvement. Now, I know some of you ladies have been like, I knew it. And when I read this, all I could think of was, oh my gosh, the things that y'all have had to put up with. God bless you, every single one of you. Now, the next one is also funny because, there's always that joke that men have selective hearing. That's not true. We have biologically worse hearing, actually. Sound is number 5. In fact, studies have shown us that in order for a boy to hear you, you have to speak about 8 decibels or 3 clicks on the radio dial louder than you do with the girl. So much so that girls may actually feel like you're yelling at them when you're just speaking in a strong or firm voice. How many dads have had to say, I'm not yelling, I'm just being firm to their daughters? So these 5 basic biological differences correspond to what the Bible says. There's also developmental differences. Number 1, in particular in the area of interests. On average, not in every case, but on average, scientists have observed that whenever given paper and crayons, girls tend to draw flowers and trees, while boys draw things like monsters, aliens, and action scenes. Number 2 is relationships. Boys tend to make friends shoulder to shoulder, whereas girls tend to make friends face to face. What does that mean? That on average, boys and men do not like to sit together face to face and talk about their life and their feelings. Instead, they would rather be doing something together, mowing the lawn, working on a project, building a house, and then through that process, they develop a friendship, whereas girls tend to like to sit around and talk about their life or share their feelings. Not only that, but after fighting, boys are much more likely to become better friends, while girls are more likely to have longer lasting hurt feelings. Number 3, aggression. Boys are more likely to need something to harness their physical aggression, whereas girls are less likely. I don't know how many parents of boys have said, my son is very rambunctious and needs something to channel his energy. Now, these are generally observed. If it's the exact opposite for you or the exact opposite for your children, that does not mean that your kids are not biological males or biological females. It just means they don't fit the typical stereotype. But there's a reason why these stereotypes are a little bit humorous to us, because there is a general correspondence to both the stereotype and what we have observed in science. The last one on your notes is risk. That when it comes to taking risks, boys are much more likely to engage in physically risky behavior like climbing trees, riding a dirt bike, jumping off a house. At earlier stages in development, I love this quote, boys are much more likely to overestimate their abilities and underestimate the risks involved. And all God's people said, yeah, wow, haven't we seen that to be true? Okay, so this is a basic theology of gender. What we know from the Bible and what also corresponds with what we know biologically and developmentally in terms of what can be scientifically observed. But now we contrast this and turn the page over to page number 12 with transgender ideology. So take everything we've just heard this morning, or this evening, it's still not morning, and listen to this quotation from Judith Butler. Judith Butler is a lesbian She is a gender theorist. She's also part of the pioneering authors of what's called queer theory. And when she originally wrote this quotation in her book, Gender Trouble, in the 1990s, she was actually talking about gender roles, how gender expresses itself in social arrangements. But what she says, what we're going to read here in just a moment, has been picked up and applied to much of the modern transgender movement. So much so that many in the transgender movement identify with exactly what she says. Here's what she says in her book. Gender is a fiction. It's a fabrication and a fantasy that can be made and remade at will. Gender is theorized as radically independent of sex. Gender itself becomes a free-floating artifice with the consequences that man and masculine might just as easily signify a female body as a male one, and woman and feminine a male body as easily as a female one. The body is itself a social construction. The body is itself a social construction. Now again, when she originally wrote this, she was speaking about gender roles, and yet this same quotation can be found and the same logic used can be identified within many in the transgender movement. And so let's talk about transgender ideology. For many of you, this may be the most helpful section because now we're going to talk about vocabulary and terminology. What is meant whenever all these different terms are used? Well, as you can see from Butler's quote, transgender ideology affirms a basic distinction between biological sex and gender identity. For centuries, sex and gender were synonyms with each other. They were considered to be one and the same. But with the advent of queer theory, the feminist movement, the sexual revolution in the 1960s, there began slowly to be an introduction of a difference or a distinction between the biological sex, what is outwardly true of you, and your gender identity, what is inwardly true of you. Biological sex in transgender ideology is what you are assigned at birth. But gender identity is what you discover or realize over time. It's not uncommon for somebody in the trans-affirming community or someone who identifies as transgender to say something like this: I was assigned female at birth, and then I realized that I'm actually... Did my microphone just go off? Okay, we're good. Or I was assigned male at birth, and then I realized I was female. That distinction between what you were assigned and what you discover is very common in the testimonies and the literature. In other words, transgender ideology prioritizes a person's psychological sense of gender identity over their biological sex. They actually put the body into a secondary subordinate category to the psychological inclinations or identifications that they experience. Why? Because for those in the transgender movement, the psychological self is the true, authentic self. What it means to be authentic is to be true to your inward sense of who you are for the people within this understanding. And so, if you remember several years ago, not too long actually, whenever Bruce Jenner did his interview with Diane Sawyer. Remember Bruce Jenner, the Olympic athlete? Whenever he came out as Caitlyn Jenner, and his transition process was a quite public reality. Listen to what he says and notice the distinctions that he's using and how the ideology of transgenderism is within his statements. Here's what he says. When God was looking down and making little Bruce, he said, let's give him all these wonderful qualities. But everyone's got to have something to deal with. What are we going to give him? I know, let's give him the soul of a female. My brain is much more female than it is male. It's hard for people to understand that, but that's what my soul is. For all intents and purposes, I am a woman. My heart and my soul and everything I do in life is this female part of me. I was not genetically born that way. Do you see those distinctions embedded within his statements? There's a distinction between the biological and the genetic versus the psychological or the inward. When he speaks about his soul being different than his body and his soul being the true part of himself that he identifies with the most. The reality is that this is not just in interviews with celebrities. It is reaching its way into childhood textbooks and into children's stories. One example of that is the book I Am Jazz, written by Jazz Jennings, someone who was born a biological boy, but then was allowed to transition and go through a gender reassignment surgery at a certain age, quite young, and became Jazz, or identified as female. In the story, Jazz talks about his transition process, namely whenever he went to a doctor, and the doctor informed him that I have a girl brain in a boy body. Afterwards, the doctor spoke to my parents, and I heard the word transgender for the very first time. And so this sort of distinction is getting into just even the basic understanding of how children even see and understand their basic identity within these books. And so let's press pause for a little bit, because I can see the look on a lot of your faces. I want to remind us all of something, that whether somebody is transgender, a transgender activist, or a person in this room, what we've been learning for the last couple of weeks is this: all people are created in the image of God. All people are worthy of dignity, of respect, and compassion, regardless of whether or not they disagree with us. And it's important to emphasize that, because whenever we talk about transgenderism, as an ism, it can be very impersonal and abstract. But we are talking about people, not mere concepts. And so that means that we must navigate these conversations with humility and compassion, and even with a willingness to understand. No matter how much we may say, that is totally wrong and I don't understand this, one of the best things that we can do is say, okay, I don't see things the same. Will you help me understand? Will you unpack this for me? And let's build a bridge of relationship. In other words, we must be like Jesus and walk in both grace and truth. That is so important to understand. That being said, the next big idea that I want you to see is that when it comes to transgender ideology, this distinction between biological sex and gender identity ultimately means that transgender ideology dishonors the human body, and it disintegrates the human person. It dishonors the human body, and it disintegrates the human person. And I don't mean that as an insult, by the way. I mean that in the most literal sense of the words. Transgenderism dishonors the human body because it says that the human body really isn't significant for understanding human identity. It really is irrelevant or incidental to understanding who I am as a human being. But it also disintegrates the human person. It literally, if you look at that word, it disintegrates the human person. To be integrated is to have a somewhat harmonious wholeness or an integration between two parts of things. And yet transgender ideology literally fragments the human person so that there is this hard separation between the psychological and the biological, the inward and the outward. And that's why for many, transgender ideology disintegrates, but it also alienates a person from themselves. So for some, here's what that means. It means that whenever they identify as transgender, this means that they think that they operate on a gender spectrum. If you've heard somebody say this, what they mean by that is that they don't fit into the clean-cut categories of male or female. They may use the term non-binary. And what they mean by that is, some days they identify more as male, and some days they identify more as female. The body, the biological reality, is irrelevant to that identification. Rather, what is most relevant is how they feel about themselves on a day-in, day-out basis. For others, this means that they firmly believe that they are trapped in the wrong body, like a prisoner inside of a cell. But in all cases, the intrinsic significance of the body is denied. The intrinsic significance of the body is denied. There are some that would say, Josh, you're totally wrong about this, because the reason why somebody goes through gender reassignment surgery is because they want to get their bodies to match how they feel. The body is, in fact, so important to them that they want to experience an integration or a wholeness between their biological and their psychological. And I actually believe there's some merit to that, because I think that all of us, at some level, we want to feel whole. We don't want to feel fragmented and disintegrated and alienated from ourselves or from our bodies. But the point, and I think the most prescient point, it's not that the body becomes totally irrelevant for somebody who identifies this way. It's that the intrinsic significance of the body is considered irrelevant. In other words, the innate biological reality is discarded in order to be manipulated and folded into something that fits with their psychological reality. Here's what we've been saying, that transgender ideology promotes the notion that biology must conform to psychology, that outward must conform to inward, that biology must conform to psychology, and that outward must conform to inward. And again, you can see this in some of the textbook literature that's coming out on this subject. So for example, you have what's called the gender-bred person. So look at this diagram with me for a second, okay? Notice how at the top you have identity, and then at the bottom you have sex. Do you see the distinction and the difference that's being made and how the separation is there? There's also attraction and expression. You can also see this with what's called the gender unicorn. The gender unicorn has basically the same idea, that internally you've got this gender identity represented by the rainbow, male, woman, girl, male, man, boys, or other genders. And then at the bottom you have a DNA molecule indicating biological sex. And so, what's the problem? What is the problem with this understanding? Why isn't this a valid way to conceive of the human person? Well, we're going to get into some of the practical consequences associated with this. But what I want to do right now, as you turn your page over, is I want to talk about what I think is one of the basic internal problems with this ideology. I call it simply the logic of transgenderism, okay? So follow me on this. How we doing? You guys doing good? Okay, so here's the logic of transgenderism. At its basic level, here's what transgenderism teaches. Premise number one, if I deeply feel I am X, then I am X. So X can be boy, X can be girl, X could be other things. But if I deeply feel I am X, then I am X. Premise two, I deeply feel I am X. Therefore, I am X. That's the basic logical structure built into transgenderism. Here's what's interesting. There are people, not too few actually, who have picked up on this basic logical structure and begun to apply it to other different kinds of changes and transitions to their life. So for example, not too long ago, there was a Dutch man who was 69 years old who began to fight a legal battle to identify as 20 years younger. It's interesting, right? Now, it's different in its behavior, but logically, if I deeply feel I am, then I am. All that's changed is we've talked about gender in one case and age in another. Not only that, there are other examples. Rachel Dolezal, who's a white woman, as of 2020, she identifies as black. She identifies as black, irregardless of her pigmentation or DNA. In another example, there's a whole group of people, you can read about them and see their pictures on the internet, that are called other kin. They are people who identify as non-human. They identify as foxes, dragons, and cats, as opposed to members of the Homo sapien family. Now, I know some of you think this is quite strange, and I understand. Believe me, I do. We can talk about all the different realities associated with it, but I want you to see every single one of these different identities follows the precise same logical structure. The moral logic is no different. If I deeply feel I am X, X could be boy, girl, cat, dog, black, white, Asian, Native American, Chinese woman, whatever. And if that is the determiner of my identity with no respective recourse to the body, then ultimately a transgender activist, if they're going to be consistent, has to affirm these things. That is actually what we should say. That while none of these are the same behavior, they follow the same logic. While none of these are the same behavior, we would never say that they're the exact same behavior. They do follow the same logic. And in order to be consistent, a trans activist must affirm these other identities as valid and real. So here's the question. Does believing you are something mean that you truly are that thing? Does believing that you truly are something mean that you truly are that thing? And the answer is a simple no, it doesn't. Just because you believe something about yourself doesn't mean that what you believe corresponds to reality. And so the big question then, and this is not in your notes, but I just want you to think about this. The big question as we wrap up this first section is this. When we think about questions of human identity, the real question is this. What will be our ultimate authority? What will be our ultimate authority? Should we submit to the subjective, what we really deeply feel, or the objective, something that is true regardless of how we feel? The subjective is the realm of feelings, emotions, desires, and attractions, all of which are important, by the way, but the Bible would say while those are important, they should not be ultimate. Because the Bible would actually tell us that we need something much more firm, much more stable, much more reliable, much more objective. And that's where God's Word and our bodies come into the picture. Now, I put the asterisk besides our bodies because I also recognize that there is this thing called the intersex conditions that are associated with many people in the transgender movement. I say many people. It really affects about 1% of the people within the transgender movement, which is already a very, very small minority of people. Scientists will actually tell us, and you'll see this in one of the appendices that I've put in your notes, that 99% of the time, even when somebody has an intersex condition, whether or not they're biologically male or biologically female is actually very, very obvious. That most intersex conditions do not take away the inherent binary nature between maleness or femaleness. But I also put the asterisk here because I understand that whenever we're sick or whenever our kids go through puberty, our bodies can be quite infuriating and confusing. Nevertheless, our bodies are much more objective because whether or not we are sick, whether or not we are healthy, our basic biological gender does not change with the passing of time. But you know what our feelings do? You know what our desires do? They do change with the passing of time. I don't know about y'all, but if I followed my heart every single day, I would be in prison right now for a very long time. In fact, on the way over here, I would have gotten so upset with somebody that cut me off that I would have slammed into their car and you would have not have seen me tonight. The Bible would say that our desires and attractions and emotions are important, but they're not ultimate. And so we cannot follow them. Instead, we must submit them to something more objective. That is the big question between God's understanding and transgender ideology. What will be our ultimate authority? What will we trust? Who will we trust? Those are really big, important questions. Okay, so now let's take a 5-minute break. Sound good? Okay, that is going to conclude our first segment. So take 5 minutes, bathroom, water, extra food, talk amongst yourselves, whatever you'd like to do, and we will keep going in a few minutes. Okay, so what we've done so far is we have covered kind of the theological and the philosophical side of the workshop tonight. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to transition a little bit into more of the medical side of things. And we're going to talk about gender dysphoria and gender transitioning. And so this is a really good time for us to put on really kind of this posture of, okay, let's try to understand what people are experiencing, because this is really where I think a lot of the value in a workshop like this can be. Although, I mean, everything I said just before I think is relevant and important, but when you actually talk to somebody, whether it's a teenager or an adult, whoever it may be, I think this is where some of the greatest benefit's going to be, just an understanding a little bit of where people are coming from. And so, let's start talking about gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria, we're on page 15 in your notes. So, gender dysphoria is a medical condition. It's a psychological condition, and it affects, on average, around 1% of people in America today. Now, that number is actually kind of high. Some studies would say it affects like 0.003%. Some would say 1.5%. And so I put 1% in there because there is a pretty large spectrum. It's all in that low kind of 1%-ish range. And so 1% is a high number just to give us kind of a good barometer of how many people are affected by it that we know about. It occurs very simply when someone experiences a mismatch between their gender identity and their biological sex. So the claim that I'm a girl trapped in a boy's body is an indication of gender dysphoria. The idea that I am non-binary, that some days I identify more as male or more as female, is an indication of gender dysphoria. It's really when somebody just expresses that who they feel themselves to be on the inside does not correspond with what they see themselves to be on the outside. Now, interestingly enough, not everyone who identifies as transgender experiences gender dysphoria. There are some biological males that just wish they were female and vice versa. And so gender dysphoria is not always the driving cause behind identifying as transgender, but in the vast majority of cases, it is. For those who do experience gender dysphoria, it can be incredibly distressing. If you have some free time, I would encourage you to, if you want to understand this more, go onto the website entitled TransHub. TransHub is actually a testimonial site. There's all sorts of resources for people who are transitioning, thinking about transitioning, all sorts of things. And there are testimonials, written testimonies of individuals who talk about their gender dysphoria. Here's what one person said. Gender dysphoria can feel different for everyone. It can manifest as distress, depression, anxiety, restlessness, or unhappiness. It might feel like anger or sadness, or feeling slighted or negative about your body, or like there are parts of you that are missing. Another person said this: gender dysphoria is something that is painful. It hurts. It's looking into the mirror and thinking, holy heck, who is that person? Who am I looking at? Is that someone that's come into my house? And then realizing, no, that's just me in the mirror. Now, I don't know if you've ever struggled with this, but if you've ever struggled at all with your weight or with your physical appearance in any way, you know how difficult it can be to not like the person that you see in the mirror, to not be very satisfied or content with the physical representation that you see. Take that normal human experience, multiply it times 1,000, and that seems to be what people are telling us about what gender dysphoria actually feels like. It's incredibly disorienting. And so you can see why they would make a recourse to their inward psychological self and put the body in a secondary category, because for them, for many of them, the body is not a source of comfort or encouragement. It's not an indication of God's design. For many, it's an indication or a source of pain and discomfort and deep struggle. So what causes gender dysphoria? What causes gender dysphoria? We're on page 16. Well, we can really talk about this at a number of different levels, but I think there are two broad categories that we can speak about that are associated with and that causally connect to gender dysphoria. Number one is gender stereotypes. Gender stereotypes that are overly strict, rigid, or culturally prevalent. This is what we talked about 2 weeks ago, or last week I should say, in the message. You know, stereotypes are what we devoted a lot of time to, so I won't spend as much time on that, but we will talk about that this evening. And then number two is underlying mental health conditions. Underlying mental health conditions. We'll talk about both. Now, on your notes, you do see a label there called rapid onset gender dysphoria. It's a pretty technical medical term. Here's where the label comes from. About 15 years ago, not even quite that long ago, there began to be massive numbers of young teenage girls who were just really well-adjusted girls. You might even call them girly girls, not tomboyish or anything like that. And then all of a sudden, they begin to experience gender dysphoria or come out as transgender. And that's why they call it rapid, because it seems like it was out of nowhere. And it was onset gender dysphoria because it was all of a sudden, this weird disconnect between their inner sense of gender and their outward sense of biology. The reason why we're not going to talk about it too much tonight is because it is a subgroup within gender dysphoria, and I would encourage you to look this up. I've given you some footnotes with some actual book-length treatments of this subject, but here's the main thing you need to know about rapid onset gender dysphoria. In the medical literature, many psychologists refer to it as a social contagion. Here's why. It does not exist without social media. It does not exist without social media. The experience of many young teenage girls is simply this, that they were well-adjusted, fitting comfortably within their gender, and then through exposure to certain people and ideas and notions on social media platforms, they begin to struggle with their identity, and it moved them in the direction, ultimately, of a peer-encouraged transition, Hence why they don't really always treat it as a medical condition, but as a social condition associated with the individuals. And so I've given you some quotations there. You can look into this more. I would encourage you to read the books, or at least the chapter in the one book that I mentioned there at the bottom. Let's talk about gender stereotypes for a little bit. What is a stereotype? Well, as we mentioned last Sunday, a stereotype is an oversimplification. It's a shorthand way of saying this is what a real man does and this is what a real woman does. And so it's, if you're a real man, you love to hunt and fish, and if you're a real woman, you love to cook and clean. And all God's people said, no, not really, actually. Those are overly strict, overly narrow, overly simplistic stereotypes. And many in the trans community identify as gender non-conforming, or as those who exist on a gender spectrum, because of how they have interpreted what it means to be male or female in the light of the stereotypes of male and female in the culture or the family they grow up in. In other words, when they say I'm gender non-conforming, what many of them mean is this, that they do not identify with or fit into typical behaviors that are customary of their gender. And so if you have a really sensitive boy who does not enjoy hunting or fishing, does not want to grow up to drive an F-250 whenever he's a grown man, he may feel like something is wrong with him because all these pictures of maleness and masculinity look a certain way, but he doesn't identify with, connect with, or fit into any of those. And so, in the absence of knowing how to interpret how he's wired and who he is, the modern world comes in and says, well, I know why you feel this way. It's because you're in fact gender non-conforming, or a girl trapped in a boy's body, or so on and so forth. And so, our response to this as the church has got to be very careful, but also very clear. Because here's the reality. Even in the church, we can contribute to gender dysphoria whenever we label certain behaviors as what it means to be a Christian man, or what it means to be a Christian woman, and then none of those things are really directly connected to chapters and verses in the Bible. And so we need to say, I think loud and clear, that gender identity does not exist on a spectrum, but gender expression most certainly does. Gender identity does not exist on a spectrum. That's the biological reality of how God created you. But gender expression most certainly does exist on a spectrum. In other words, you can be a boy and love to cook or make music. You can be a girl and love to hunt and fish. You can be a boy and be emotionally sensitive. And you can be a girl who is rough and tumble. None of those things mean that you're not a boy or not a girl. It just means you're a certain kind of boy or a certain kind of girl. Again, Leonard Sachs puts it this way in his book. The average boy is different from the average girl in many ways. But on most of these parameters, the average boy is not the opposite of the average girl, just different. And there's a lot of variation among boys and a lot of variation among girls. If you are a man who has some or many feminine qualities, or you are a woman who has some or many masculine qualities, that does not mean you're transgender. It just means you're a human being. It just means you're a human being. And as our kids are growing up and growing into adolescence, this is something important for them to know. That if they do not fit into certain attractions or preferences or interests that are customary with the stereotype, that does not mean that they are not the biological gender that God created them. It just simply means that they have different kinds of interests. Why do we say this? Because here's what that means. Stereotypes are descriptive. They are not prescriptive. In other words, stereotypes describe how men and women often behave, but they do not always describe how men and women ought to behave. We're on the bottom of page 18. To say that a stereotype is descriptive is just simply to say we are describing what is oftentimes true of men and women. But the moment we say this is what men and women do, therefore this is what men and women ought to do, if we do not have a chapter and a verse that is properly interpreted and applied to that, then we run the risk of binding somebody's conscience to something that God has not actually said or commanded them to do. And that can be very, very risky and dangerous, especially on this issue. Stereotypes, in other words, are always changing. They're always changing, but God's word is not. How many of you in this room have seen the movie Braveheart? Anybody seen Braveheart? What did the men in Braveheart fight in? Kilts. Anybody going to wear a kilt to church next Sunday? Derek might. That's great. We're going to make fun of you. I'm just kidding. Stereotypes are changing. It used to be cool and manly and masculine for Scottish warriors to wear dresses into battle. It's not true that way anymore. Why? It's a stereotype. It's a stereotype that is changing, but God's word does not. Bible plus biology is better than culture plus psychology. Bible plus biology is so much better for determining who we should be and how we should act as men and women than culture plus psychology. Because when we let culture guide us, the consequences can be very, very serious. Now, of course, like I said last Sunday, this does not mean that all stereotypes are unbiblical. You've got sections there in your notes that elucidate this, that there are, in fact, real, true gender distinctions, gender role differences within the church and within the home that God has given us in His Word. But even within those distinctions, there is a variety of how that is to look. So, for example, when I became a husband, when I got married, I was taught and I was told, Josh, guess what? You are now the spiritual leader of your household. And I was like, what does that mean? I've never been one of those before. How do I do that? And my impression was, okay, to be the spiritual leader of the household, Ephesians 5, Colossians 3, I need to do family devotions with my wife every single evening. Ask me how long that went. Did not go very well. And so some of you may have great success with that. My wife and I, that's not how we do family devotions, or that's not how we do spiritual leadership in the home. Now, don't get me wrong, we pray together, we read scripture together, we talk about Jesus together in our home, but how that looks is different, and that's the point. That when it comes to the commands that God has given us for gender roles, there is, in fact, a lot of freedom for how that is to look. That will vary from person to person, relationship to relationship, and family to family. The big point that we have to be so clear about is that we cannot let culture, whether it's the outside culture, family culture, or even bad church culture, be our guide. Because when we do, the consequences get very, very serious. And that's where we talk about now transgenderism and mental health. For many people in the trans community, many trans people, especially teenagers, they have coexisting mental health concerns. Higher rates, in other words, of anxiety, depression, eating disorders, and more. Trans people experience higher rates even of borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia, OCD, ADHD, and many of them are on the autism spectrum. In fact, a significant percentage of children who identify as transgender exhibit traits of autism. One study even indicates as many as half may have traits of autism. And this is why this is so important, because for many people, they believe that treating the underlying gender identity issues is the real cause of their distress. But then they find out that it was actually underlying issues that were more prevalent and more causatory of their struggles in life. And this is one of the big concerns that I and many have, especially those in the children's medical community, that if we only treat the gender dysphoria, these other things will remain unchecked or undealt with, and those are actually the real causes of the child's struggles. In fact, for many health professionals, gender dysphoria needs to be considered a mental health disorder or condition on its own. That in and of itself, it needs to be considered something that is to be treated appropriately. So, someone who truly believes something that is untrue about themselves needs counseling and they need compassion, but they don't need surgery, and they definitely don't need affirmation in this wrong direction. I want you to think for a moment, what would you say to a young girl who is physically fit, but who has an eating disorder? And because of how she views her body, she wants you to pay for her to have liposuction. Like, she is physically fit. Her biological reality is healthy, but internally she believes that she is overweight or obese. So much so that she wants to have a surgery to alter her body to match her psychology, to alter her outward appearance, to match her inward feelings. How would we respond to that person? Well, I think that if we're being gracious and compassionate and truthful, we would not encourage or approve of that surgery. Instead, we would try to help her to get her mind and her feelings to match the objective reality of her body, instead of changing her body to match the subjective reality of her mind or her feelings. But again, if we follow the logic of transgenderism, then we should allow her to change her biological makeup in favor of her psychological beliefs. And this would be so destructive to her. If we would not encourage a young, healthy girl to get to get a liposuction for an eating disorder, then we certainly should not encourage somebody to get a gender reassignment surgery for their gender dysphoria. Paul McHugh was actually one of the pioneering professors of psychology and surgeons in this field for many, many years at Johns Hopkins University until he left the gender reassignment practice because he believed that fundamentally there was malpractice being taken place whenever it came to these surgeries. Here's what he says in one of his documents on the literature. He says that gender dysphoria, the official psychiatric term for feeling oneself to be the opposite sex, belongs in the family of similarly disordered assumptions about the body, such as anorexia nervosa and body dysmorphic disorder. Its treatment should not be directed at the body, as with surgery and hormones, any more than one treats obesity-fearing anorexic patients with liposuction. Instead, the treatment should strive to correct the false, problematic nature of the assumption and to resolve the psychosocial conflicts provoking it. With youngsters, this is best done in family therapy. Sadly, though, now we're on page 20. Sadly, many healthcare professionals disagree with Dr. McHugh, and they advocate instead for just the opposite, a process known as gender transitioning. Now, it's important to say that gender transitioning actually looks different for everyone and has different layers to it. On the one level, you have what's called social transitioning. Social transitioning is just beginning to change your appearance, maybe change your pronouns, change your name, beginning to dress in a certain way to identify with the opposite sex. There's also hormone therapy or cross-sex hormones that children can get at certain ages. And then there is full gender reassignment surgery. Even within gender reassignment surgery, there is variation. There's top surgery, there's bottom surgery, and then there's the whole makeup surgery. However, and this is very, very important to understand at a basic level, someone does not really become another gender after surgery. Instead, they become a surgically altered version of themselves. When a boy transitions to become a girl, he doesn't actually become a biological girl. No, it becomes a surgically altered boy. When a girl has her breasts removed, she does not become a boy. She becomes a surgically altered girl. How do we know that? Because their DNA does not change. Their DNA does not change at any point in time in this process. As a matter of fact, if for some reason somebody 100 years ago wanted to dig up that person's bones, they would have no way of interviewing that person to know their psychological gender identity. But you know what they would have? Their DNA. Their biological DNA does not remain changed. In fact, even in the transgender community, in the early advocacy and the early healthcare professionals like Dr. McHugh, like John Money, like Harry Benjamin, many of the men who pioneered these studies in the 1960s admitted this, that this is not actually changing from one sex to another. It is altering to help somebody fit within their psychological makeup. And the consequences are often quite tragic. So this is actually what I did half of my thesis on, was looking at some of the medical consequences associated with gender reassignment surgery. So on page 22 now, there's 3 different categories of problematic results that come from this sort of transitioning process. The first is with respect to children. Here's the reality. There is currently no long-term study that conclusively shows the benefits of gender transitioning or reassignment surgery. In fact, to the contrary, taking cross-sex hormones has been shown to be linked to dangerous health risks, including cardiac disease, high blood pressure, blood clots, stroke, diabetes, cancer, and many other things. In other words, here's what happens a lot of times. Individuals who go through a gender reassignment surgery or go through some kind of transitioning, oftentimes their gender dysphoria does decrease, but their ongoing medical conditions persist. So much so that taking the cross-sex hormones actually can contribute to them dying at younger ages than they naturally would have because of how their body responds to these different hormones in their body. As a matter of fact, here's what's fascinating. That across all the studies that we have, and there's 11 of them, by the way, there's 11 long-term studies that are showing us what's happening with individuals, children, who are going through this process. Here's what they tell us. That between 60 and 90% of all children and teenagers who experience gender dysphoria, they experience natural relief when they pass through puberty. Natural relief when they pass through puberty. In other words, just like for all of us, puberty is very, very difficult and very, very confusing. And yet on the other side of that, there tends to be a consistency or a harmony between their biological sex and their gender identity. Again, Paul McHugh, he puts the number even higher. He says that all competent authorities agree that that between 80 and 95% of children who say that they are transgender come to accept their sex and enjoy emotional health by late adolescence. So here's what this means. That if the long-term studies show us damage, consequences, medical problems, and if the long-term studies show us that most children, a high percentage of children will pass through their gender dysphoria on the other side of puberty, here's the tragic reality. That at present, the trans-affirming medical community is engaged in a massive experiment on children. It's a massive experiment on children to see if they'll turn out right when all the data says the exact opposite. And this brings us to some of the psychological problems associated with transitioning on page 25. As a population, transgender people experience higher rates of depression, anxiety, and psychological distress of various kinds. And the many studies that we have on the long-term follow-up of individuals post-reassignment surgery actually tell us that there is no advantage of surgery. No advantage of surgery. That's a quote from a 2011 study that was done in Sweden that was a long-term follow-up study of individuals who had received a reassignment surgery between 1973 and 2003. Now, of course there are exceptions. Of course there are exceptions to this. If you talk to somebody who seems well-adjusted and seems to be functioning just fine, that is not abnormal. But the majority of studies indicate that on the other side of reassignment surgery, there is no advantage. And here's what that means. That if these individuals are already experiencing heightened levels of depression, heightened levels of anxiety, heightened levels of distress, no advantage of surgery means those heightened levels continue in their life after the surgery has been performed. In fact, that's one of the things that is coming out now with the whole movement known as the detransitioners. The internet, in fact, has been exploding with testimonies of individuals who had gender dysphoria, went through a reassignment surgery or some kind of transitioning, only to discover that it did not resolve their psychological distress. And now they've detransitioned to try to harmonize with their biological sex. In fact, just 2 months ago, back in March, there was National Detrans Awareness Day. There's a whole organization called the Detransition Network, full of individuals who are speaking out against the medical community, saying, you should have questioned me. You should have challenged me. You should not have let me go through with this. I was a 13-year-old kid. And yet, in the moment, many parents and clinicians will say, you were so adamant about this, and the surrounding culture would have absolutely rejected me or labeled me as a hateful, bigoted person if I didn't go through with this. One individual who's spoken out is a young girl by the name of Helena Kirschner. You can read her whole story on her blog, in which she talks about her story and the blog titled By Any Other Name, The Story of My Transition and Detransition. And it's quite lengthy. It is longer than a Josh Gatewood sermon to get through this blog, I promise you. But I want to give you some of the highlights of this story, because here's what Helena says. She talks about how early on she looked like this. She was a well-adjusted young girl. She would even call herself a girly girl. And then when she got into her early teenage years, she began to go through puberty, and she began to experience normal struggles with her body. And not only that, but those normal struggles grew into an eating disorder, and she deeply struggled with her appearance in the mirror. This is Helena at the age of 15, not yet identifying as transgender, but with an eating disorder and with lots of sadness and self-loathing. She talks about how she was introduced to transgender ideology on social media. Specifically, she says this, that she was introduced to trans ideology on Tumblr when she was 15, and she began to identify as non-binary. And this sent her deeper and deeper down the trans identity rabbit hole. Shortly after turning 18, she went to Planned Parenthood and was prescribed a testosterone regimen. And she remained on testosterone for a year and a half. And she claims that at the end of a year and a half, she realized that it had an extremely negative effect on her mental health. And she finally admitted what a disaster it had been when she was 19. Now, between the age of 15 and 18, before she got on her testosterone treatment, she began to social transition, changing her pronouns, cutting her hair, and looking differently. This is what Helena looked like between the age of 15 and 18, whenever she was in high school, shortly after beginning to identify as trans. She eventually, after getting on the testosterone treatment, went off to college, and it was at college that she realized how destructive and painful this whole thing was for her. Looking back, here's what she says. When the disillusionment fully set in, I stopped the testosterone treatment and began the process of getting my life back on track. It has not been easy, and the whole experience seriously derailed my life in ways that I could never have foreseen when I was that 15-year-old kid playing with pronouns on Tumblr. Here's what Helena looks like today. Helena is now a 23-year-old young woman who is actively speaking out and speaking about her experience and the realities associated with gender dysphoria, transgender ideology, and the treatment that is being promoted. And here's her warning to all of us, parents and leaders, but individuals who are considering this for themselves. She says this: today, any young person who remotely struggles with self-esteem, making friends, fitting into common gender roles, or body image is now vulnerable to being subjected to what amount to medical experiments that may permanently destroy the prior functioning of their bodies before they have had the chance to build identity and strength through the normal means of overcoming life's challenges. Here's what's interesting about her statement. Look at that top part of the quote. Any young person who remotely struggles with self-esteem, making friends, fitting into common gender roles, or body image. Isn't that all of us whenever we were a teenager? You know what she's saying? That any young person, through the natural experience of puberty, if we don't help them interpret that season of life, someone else will. And someone else may lead them down a path of self-destruction. And so getting articulate, or at least getting conversational and getting comfortable with these sorts of things is so important and so essential for us. Because the most tragic reality on the other side of this is the reality of suicide. The reality of suicide. See, one of the myths out there, and now we're on page 29. One of the myths out there is that non-affirming people are responsible for the deaths of countless transgender people. The idea being that if we don't affirm somebody in their new pronouns, name, identity, or transition, then it's going to be so distressing that it'll lead them to suicide. Now, what's interesting is Helena is making an important observation about this one claim, that many people who make this claim, the reason why not affirming them is so traumatic is because they have not learned how to deal with the normal setbacks and disappointments of life all the way up until this point. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But this statement is actually not true. Because the truth is that suicide rates are up to 20 times higher after treatment or surgery. And this is true, by the way, even in countries like Sweden, which is one of the most LGBTQ affirming nations in the world. Now, we can't, of course, discount how surrounding environment and people being mean and all sorts of things can affect how somebody feels about themselves or even to the point of wanting to take their life. I understand what it's like to want to take your life. That's part of my story of coming to know Jesus. I've been down that road. I understand how social factors contribute to that. And at the same time, we cannot lay responsibility simply at surrounding culture when the surrounding culture is in fact very affirming, and yet on the other side of surgery, suicide rates actually continue to increase. Again, there are exceptions, but by and large, this is the rule. And so when it comes to gender dysphoria, and when it comes to gender transitioning, the medical literature, of which we've only briefly reviewed, and I've given you more there in your notes, seems to point us in the direction of remembering and honoring God's design for the human body, and remembering and honoring what we do know from observed medical science. The question then, I know that you're all thinking is, okay, thanks Josh for the information, made my head hurt, I appreciate this. Now, how do we talk to our kids about this? And what do we do whenever we get into conversation with our young people today? Those are great questions, but I think we all need one more 5-minute break before we jump into those. Sound good? Okay, one more 5-minute break, and then we'll do our last segment to conclude our evening. Okay, so we're on page 30. We are now in the kind of what can we do segment. So how do we take all this stuff that we've talked about at a theological, philosophical, medical level and distill this down into our everyday lives? So that's what we're going to spend the next 20 minutes talking about, is just what do we do with this information and with the people in our lives, especially our young people who are being affected by this and navigating it personally. So here's what I've done. I've tried to distinguish between what I think are called the upstream realities versus the downstream realities. Upstream realities are, if you're raising young kids, and this has not become an issue yet, what can you do upstream to be proactive and to get out ahead of this in your relationships and in your conversations with them? This could also be if you're working with kids in the church or in any sort of capacity. Downstream is, man, if this is a real reality in your home right now, either as a teenager or you have an adult child who's thinking about transitioning or is transitioning, all of us I know are affected and touched on this at a number of different levels, and so this will be for you as well. I will tell you that unfortunately we can only speak in generalities. Every single case is going to be unique and distinct, and that's why Gary said you can call him anytime for any of those particular questions. But for now, I'm going to give you what I think are some good, helpful, general principles, biblical principles, hopefully, that will be helpful for you. So let's start talking about the upstream reality. Number one, parents in the home. I think the first and one of the most important things that we can do is we can cultivate a healthy emotional climate in your home. Cultivate a healthy emotional climate in your home. In other words, have a home that is emotionally healthy, where it is safe to talk about and deal with the hard realities of life, but also a home where you celebrate and laugh and there is joy and celebration. Here's what I'm saying. In no uncertain terms, talk about your feelings. Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. I cannot emphasize this enough. That so much of the identity struggles that our young people feel, whether it's transgender or not, just identity struggles in general, can oftentimes be deeply alleviated if they just know that their mom and or dad cares about what they're feeling, cares about what they're going through, cares about what they're struggling with. So asking questions like, hey, how are you feeling today? Or when something bad or good happens, hey, how did that make you feel? Do you feel angry? Do you feel sad? Do you feel upset? What do you feel? I know in my life, I have felt these sorts of emotions at different times in my life as well. This is massively important because feelings oftentimes get shoved down and ignored, and we have the mentality of just suck it up and deal with it. There's a time for that. We'll talk about that next. But oftentimes, when those feelings don't get dealt with in a healthy way, they come out later on in dysfunctional ways. One of the best things we can do is teach our kids to follow the model of the psalmist who gave his emotions to God, who said, God, I'm angry. God, I'm upset. God, I'm sad. Will you help me? Will you be with me in this? This is also important because I think that God has given us emotions to actually form the close relational bonds that solidify our influence and our love relationship with our kiddos. I don't know who first said this, but I love this expression. Rules without relationship leads to rebellion. Rules without relationship leads to rebellion. If we just give our kids the what, and we just tell them, here's what God says, the right and the wrong, but we don't actually have a relational context for which those rules can find their home in, it's going to be very, very easy for our kids, if they don't know or feel loved by us, to reject our rules when they get around somebody who does make them feel loved and accepted. I had a good friend tell me years ago, I thought he was so on point. He said, listen closely, we tend to adopt the beliefs of those who love and accept us the most. We tend to adopt the beliefs of those who love and accept us the most. If our kiddos do not have that sense of love and acceptance in their heart from us, then it's going to be very, very easy for them to get seduced by the transgender activism on the internet or the pro-LGBTQ affirming causes out in the world. So here's what that means. In a very practical sense, lots of I love you and lots of it's okay to cry. Lots of I love you and lots of it's okay to cry. I was a very emotional kid. I was told I was a sissy if I was crying. That was not always the best thing for me. Our kiddo is also a very emotional kid, and there are times when I tell him, hey buddy, it's time to quit crying because like an hour is enough. But there are times when you just got to go, hey, it's okay to cry. Let's let these things out and let's give them to the Lord. That's the first thing. Cultivate a healthy emotional climate in your home. Number 2 is the other side of that, which I think is the appropriate and helpful balance. Help them cultivate toughness and resilience. Help them cultivate toughness and resilience. So toughness does not always mean quit crying. Toughness can mean, hey, when we're done crying, we're getting back in the game. Hey, when we're done talking about this, we're going back to school tomorrow. Hey, when we're done having all of our conversation about this, we're going to keep doing whatever that thing may be. Again, so much of the outburst associated with somebody not affirming a new trans identity can be in many ways correlated to how a young person is just not ready to deal with the disappointments and the pushbacks associated with everyday life by the time they become a teenager. Here's what I'm saying. One of the worst things we can do if we're trying to cultivate a healthy emotional climate for our kids, one of the worst things we can do is go to the extreme and coddle our kids out of toughness and character. That would not be helpful. And so here is my plug for something that we have found deeply helpful in our house. I would recommend jiu-jitsu for every single parent of young children. Yes, that's my kiddo right there with the blonde hair. And I got to tell you, we saw this come true yesterday. A month ago, Caleb had his first jiu-jitsu tournament. He lost his third place matches, did not get a medal. He had more overwhelming loss and frustration in that tournament than he had victory. Well, then yesterday was his second tournament. And yesterday, I watched my kid who lost his first matches at his first tournament, cried every single match, y'all. I mean, it was emotional. I watched him come back to his tournament yesterday and get second place and third place in his different divisions. And I looked him in the face and I said, buddy, I am happy you got medals, but I am proud of you for not giving up. I'm proud of you for not giving up. So whether it's jiu-jitsu or volleyball or learning a musical instrument, whatever it may be, put your kid in environments where toughness and resilience are the byproduct of sticking with it, and then you become their best cheerleader in the process. This should say 3. Sorry, math is hard. I'm not good with numbers. Number 3, be proactive about gender and sexuality conversations. Here's what we're saying. Start early, and you be the one that brings it up. I understand that talking about sexual body parts can be one of the most awkward and uncomfortable things for a parent. I also understand that some parents talk about this way too much in their home, and you're like, I don't want to scar my child. I understand. Figure out what works for you, but it is best, we think, if your children hear it from you first. Because again, if they don't hear it from you, they're still going to hear it from someone else. Might as well be under your loving care and provision in the process. Next one. Teach and explain the goodness of God's design. Again, that should be number 4. My apologies. Teach and explain the goodness of God's design. Again, here's how we say it in our home. Buddy, God created you a boy on purpose and for a purpose, and it is good. You don't have to be this kind of boy. You can be this kind of boy. If you have girls, you don't have to be this kind of girl. You can be this kind of girl. To have different interests does not mean that you're less of a boy or a girl, and it doesn't mean that you're not a boy or a girl. It just means you're a different kind of boy or girl. Teach and explain the goodness of God's design for them. Next, model the beauty and the goodness of God's design for gender roles in the home. Here's one of the secrets associated with individuals who struggle with gender dysphoria and pursue an identity that is trans-affirming. There is a lot of medical documentation that say that many children who go this route, who have these deep struggles with their identity, you know what is a common feature for many of them? ACE, adverse childhood experiences. You know what that's a code for? Abuse. Abuse. Many children have seen an emotional climate that was unhealthy go to an extreme where certain gender roles or just the outright outlandish behavior of one or both of the parents or a step-parent who stepped in was just harsh, abrasive, neglectful, or abusive. And so when we start talking about the goodness of God's design or the goodness of God's gender roles, they hear that and they think about their negative, bad experiences in the home. Even in the church, whenever when we say things like the husband is the head of the household or the spiritual leader in the home, many people do not know how to hear that outside of a context of abuse because they heard their own father use that, or they heard church leaders use that to manipulate and to harshly abuse the people under their care. But what if we could change the narrative? What if in our home, husband and wife flourished and thrived because we loved and we cared for each other so deeply, and there was joy, and there was laughter, and there were smiles, and there was Jesus all over us, and our kids saw that. And then whenever your kids ask you, hey, Dad, why do you talk to Mom that way? Because my friend, his parents are divorced, and they don't talk like that. You look at your child and you say, well, buddy, because Jesus has told me to love your mom with my very life. And I do. I love her so much. Or whenever your kid asks you, hey, Mommy, why do you trust Daddy so much? Because I hear all these other moms or women talking about the men in their life being so horrible. And you say, you know, I really trust your dad because his leadership and care for us has always been good. And even when I disagree with him, God seems to work things out in the end. The reality is that we have a chance not to throw good gender roles out with the bathwater, but to model their goodness for our kids. Of course, in the process, this means we cannot box our kids in with unbiblical cultural stereotypes. It means love your kid as your kid. We've talked about that a lot. It also means help them interpret their emotions and their natural transitions. Help them interpret their emotions and their natural transitions. And then finally, what says number 7 but should be number 8 is place wise limits and boundaries around technology, especially social media. I am not anti-technology. I don't know if I'm anti-social media. I haven't decided that yet. But I really am sensitive to the fact that so much cultural messaging comes into our lives and into our children's lives through social media. So much so that it's an entirely new group of social interaction. For many in social media and in our schools, the reality of social media pressure leads them to do and act on and identify with the many things that they do. In fact, you could even put it this way, and this is becoming more and more the case. And there's no medical, I can't give you this like a statistic, but just what I've observed. That in my generation, doing some sort of sexual activity with your boyfriend or girlfriend, that has been translated into identifying as trans or identifying as non-binary. There are more and more young people that it is now the cool thing to do to buck traditional authorities and gender categories and identify with this new social community along the lines of transgenderism. And a lot of that influence, there's no way around it, comes through Twitter, Snapchat, Facebook, YouTube, etc. Now, it doesn't mean, by the way, that you completely shut off all technology, because technology is here to stay, and we've got to teach our kids how to use technology in a safe and wise and effective way. Maybe that means that you say no technology or no cell phone or no iPad except on the weekends. Or maybe you say only 1 hour a day. You figure out what you think is best and what works for you, but we've got to have limits. We've got to have boundaries in order to teach them wisdom around these issues. Those are, I think, 8 suggestions to be proactive upstream on this. What about downstream? What do you do if your kid comes up to you tomorrow and says, Mom, Dad, I need to talk to you? Or maybe they've already had that conversation with you and you're navigating it presently. What are some things that we could encourage you to do? Well, I've given you a lot of suggestions on this workbook. As a matter of fact, you need to know the workbook you have may actually be incomplete because I updated this section 2 days ago, which I think means that it did not get to the printer in time. This section will be updated on the website version of the workbook. So much more could be said on this subject. But let me give you 5 things. Number 1, don't stop loving them. Don't stop loving them. Regardless of where you land or what you agree or disagree with, make sure you communicate with your words, hey, this does not change that I love you. This does not change how we feel about you. We unconditionally, no conditions, love you. That's, I think, first. We have to communicate that clearly. Secondly, I think it would be helpful. Try to understand before being understood. Again, teenagers, they want to know that we care about what they're experiencing. They want to know that we value where they're coming from. For so many teenagers, young adults, my generation in general, we just want to know that you see us, that you hear us, and that you understand us. And if we don't feel seen, heard, or understood, we ain't got no time for you. And so, in many ways, one of the best things we can do before we even say anything in response is go, okay, tell me where you're coming from. Unpack this for me. What do you mean by male? What do you mean by female? What do you mean by non-binary? Help me understand what you're talking about and where you're coming from. Even if you have to save the second conversation in which you disagree with them or push back for a second conversation, and all you do for 45 minutes is just let them unpack for you where they're coming from, that could do wonders in letting them know you care, you hear, and that could be really valuable for them. But number 3, and this is really important, don't stop being a parent. Don't stop being a parent. That means you still have rules to enforce, and you can still require them to do things that are good for them. For the entirety of time that they're under your roof, God has said you are the good and loving and trusted authority to care for your children. Here's the deal. Somebody's going to be the boss. It's either going to be you or it's going to be your kid. There is no way to get around the authority-submission dynamic within the home. Somebody is going to be the authority. Either your kid's going to be or you're going to be. God says it should be you because conceivably and hopefully there's more wisdom, there's more grace, there's more nuance within your life than in your adolescent's mind. And so you have to still be a parent. You cannot reverse those roles. Again, that will look different. You may find that your line is a little bit closer, a little bit further away on certain things. That's fine. But don't stop being a parent. Let me give you a suggestion. If your child comes to you or has already come to you and said, hey, I think I'm non-binary, or I think I'm transgender, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you get to the point of actually pushing back or asking them some other questions, here's one thing you might ask them to do. Hey, son, daughter, thank you for opening up to me. Thank you for being honest with me and telling me what you're struggling with. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever looked into any of the stories of all those that have detransitioned, that have gone through what you're feeling and then regretted the transition process? You know, before you make a life-changing decision like this, why don't we do some research together? And then as their parent, you require them to read and to listen to the testimonials of people like Helena. Let them get firsthand experience of what it's like on the other side. And as a parent, I'm just going to be honest. I think you can require them to do that, and that's okay. Number 4, no matter what happens, walk with them. Walk with them through it. Don't just say, hey, you go read the Bible. Hey, you go to church. Hey, youth group, go have fun. Take care of this. Don't do that. Walk with them. Be involved. Be invested. Be stubbornly loyal and loving through all of life's challenges. Make sure that as much as you can, you communicate to your kiddos with your words and with your actions that whatever happens to them, you're always going to be there. And you can be the one they can count on. And that leads us to number 5. Reach out. Reach out. Don't try to walk through this alone. I joked and said that Gary would love for you to call him with all the details of the particular circumstances you find yourself in. But do you know that this is actually one of the reasons why God has placed elders within the church to shepherd the flock, to care for the people? Y'all, I'm just going to be honest. I don't know if you feel this way. I feel this way. We have some amazing elders at Stonegate Fellowship in Odessa and in Midland, and their wives are even better than they are. I mean, I'm telling you, we've just got some amazing men and women that God has put into this place of leadership and care. Who, you know what, they may not have all the answers, but they can love you and walk with you and encourage you through whatever it is you find yourself in. And so, as we've said every week, if you are in that place right now, man, send an email, raise a hand. Let us be your church family. Let us help you bear this burden and figure out what it looks like. Because here's the deal. I don't know if I've said this already. I hope you hear me say this tonight. The reality is that we as parents and leaders, we're kind of the trailblazers for knowing how to navigate this reality. No one's really had to do it as much as we have before us. We're figuring this out. We may make some mistakes along the way, but here's what I know. We got to figure it out together. We have to figure it out together. We have to do this together. Otherwise, we're going to drown into the sea of confusion and frustration. So let's do this together, whatever that may mean and whatever that may look like. Because at the end of the day, whether you're someone who struggles with these things, you're a parent, you're a leader, at the end of the day, the message that we want to communicate on this issue of gender actually goes back to a Bible verse that many of you probably memorized and that I remember whenever I was a young kid. And it's one of my favorite verses to this day. It's the verse in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 through 8. In this verse, here's what we read. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding. Seek his will in all that you do, and he will show you which path to take. Don't be impressed with your own wisdom. Instead, fear or worship the Lord and turn away from evil. And then you will have healing for your body and strength for your bones. If I could simplify and distill everything down from tonight's workshop, it's simply this. Us learning how to communicate to our young people how to trust the Lord with every aspect of their life, but in particular with their body, with their struggles, and with the challenges that come with being a teenager in today's world. If we can do that, if we can keep that as our North Star, then yeah, we're going to make some mistakes along the way. No, we're not going to be perfect. But I think that is the vision, the direction, and ultimately the place the Lord wants to lead us to trusting him over our culture and over ourselves, because when we trust him, it's healing for the body and strength for the bones. Amen? Amen. 8:01, y'all. Close enough. Well, I can't tell y'all how much I appreciate your time, your attention. Thank you so much. I mean, to listen to me for 2 hours, you got to have some kind of stamina. I appreciate y'all very much. And I got to tell you, I mean, just, golly, these Sunday morning sermons between the last 2 weeks, the workshops, I mean, so many of you have texted me that you've been praying for me, and I thank you and I appreciate you so much. It is everything to know that I can do what I did tonight and what I did this morning in the context of a loving and supportive church community. And so thank you guys so much from the bottom of my heart. I deeply appreciate you and your love and your support. It really means the world. And so thank you so much. Again, if you want to stay and ask me or Gary or Kent or Tanya or Jennifer or anybody some questions, we're going to be here for a few minutes. But if you've got kiddos, hey, go get those kiddos, go get them home, and we'll see you guys later, okay?